So this is work that was funded by the Texas Park and Wildlife in conjunction with the San Antonio Zoo and the University of Minnesota. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about these rough-footed mud turtles and how they're doing. What is their population structure? Where are they at? What's going on with them? Okay, let me make sure my clickies work. Okay, the slide changed, right? We're good? Okay.
Yeah, you
So
good.
I'd like to introduce you to the rough-footed mud turtle, Kinosternon hirtipes. Look at this cutie. I love its little nose. I think that's my favorite part. Now there are 6 subspecies of Kinosternon hirtipes. 5 of those subspecies are restricted to very small geographic areas. With one of them, the focus of today's talk being Kinosternon hirtipes murrayi, and it has the largest distribution of all of them. But keep murrayi in your brain because we're going to talk about it a lot. Now, here's the distribution of Kinosternon hirtipes, all 6 subspecies. This is a very handy way to look at this data from iNaturalist. Big shout out to all of our citizen scientists for providing us really incredibly accurate data that we can use to track where these turtles are. So you can see they're found in northern Mexico and southern Texas, little bits of it. But they are aquatic turtles, so they're isolated to really small watersheds. And as you can imagine, most of this is desert, which is awesome. I love the desert. There's not enough desert in Minnesota. No, I'm not going to say that. There's plenty of desert in Minnesota. They don't need any more because there is none. Everywhere is different. That is fine. But let's talk about the actual 6 subspecies. So this is work that was done mostly in the 70s by John Iverson. We have Kinosternon hirtipes, located in a pretty small area near Mexico City, Valle de Mexico. We have Kinosternon hirtipes terracens. I think I said that right. Which is found in one basin, like a single water basin, down here in Michoacan. We have KH chapellense, sure, which are found in just 2 lakes, down in Jalisco. Magdalens, found in a single valley, also down here in Jalisco. We have Kinosternon hirtipes megacephalum, which is found in a desert oasis in Coahuila. And then most of this distribution is Kinosternon hirtipes murrayi. And you can see these are the turtles that go all the way up to Texas, and they also have a substantial population down towards Mexico City too. So one of the reasons why we look at this subspecies so closely is, 5 of these subspecies are found in super isolated areas, but murrayi is found all over, and that's quite interesting for us. So here's some habitat challenges for these hirtipes. All of the subspecies, they're aquatic, so they rely on sources of fresh water. They're isolated to small lakes, ponds, and rivers, and generally require rivers in order to migrate. They're found in the desert, where we know that water is pretty scarce and hard to find and incredibly important for life in the desert. Because they're aquatic, they have a fairly limited range. That's why 5 of those subspecies are found in teeny tiny areas. And then they're facing the major challenge of water usage has changed a lot in the last 100 years, mostly due to population growth, urbanization, and substantial expansion of agriculture just in the last 100 years. So those changing water practices actually have a really big impact on desert water, and as a result, in our turtles. So I showed you some pictures earlier of Kinosternon hirtipes megacephalum, this little cutie down here. And this subspecies was first identified in the 1970s in the area of Viesca in Coahuila, Mexico. At the time, Viesca was an oasis. It had rivers, lakes, ponds, in a very desert, in a desert. Um, but dam construction and agriculture in the 60s transformed the entire area into salt flats. That's a massive environmental shift for this area. This paper, for example, is called Viesca from Oasis to Wasteland, and that seems pretty accurate. As a result, in 2013, Megacephalum was actually declared extinct as a subspecies. Researchers went out into the field to try to survey them, and they couldn't find a single aquifer within 60 kilometers of their habitat. So we've already, lost a subspecies of this turtle to just rapid environmental changes due to agriculture, dam construction, upstream water problems. So in about 2020, we set out to assess the taxonomic status of Kinosternon hirtipes subspecies and get a sense of the genomic and ecological differentiation that might be occurring in these subspecies. So this was funded by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department Conservation License Plate Fund. So if you live in Texas, I don't know why you wouldn't have one of these license plates. Look at this sick ass, horned lizard. Honestly, would move to Texas for this horned lizard license plate. But these conservation plates fund really cool research, including what we did previously with Kinosternon hirtipes. So to get a sense of the subpopulations that are around, especially after the extinction of Megacephalum, we collected 141 individuals across 18 localities and all 5 remaining subspecies, and took a look at the genetic diversity of these populations and tried to get a sense of the population structure of all of these turtles, largely to understand the conservation status for them. So one of the cool things that they found in this paper back in 2022 is that the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt, TMVB here, found in Mexico City is around here, is a really substantial geographic barrier for animals, particularly for little turtles. So this is a region that, due to tectonic plate activity and volcanoes, active and non-active, there's a substantial elevation changes that happen along this region. For example, I think Mexico City is somewhere between 7 and 8,000 feet in elevation. And what we were found in 2022 is that these subspecies of Kinosternon hirtipes down here, all, when you put them on a phylogenetic tree to just graph their relationship in time, separate quite distinctly based on if they are within the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt or north of it up here. And so looking at this data, we have our Kinosternon hirtipes murrayi northern populations, these ones up here, are branched quite significantly from the ones in the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt. But we still have a population of murrayi down here in the belt that is quite disparate from the northern population. And you can see that based on how diverged they are on this tree compared to the northern ones. So Weaver took a closer look at this, and here's a way to kind of visualize the genetic similarities between different individuals and try to put them on a plot. So 2 individuals that are exactly the same would show up in the same location on this plot on the X and Y axis, and 2 that are very genetically different will show up further away. And when he does that with all the species, the populations, sorry, that's my dog. She has a cough. You get a cluster of the northern murrayi species that are completely separate from the those southern Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt species, and quite a bit separate from other subspecies of hirtipes. And we can actually, like, using some cool modeling, look at the ancestral, kind of approximate the ancestral origins of these individuals. So on these plots, each line is an individual. And our model is attempting to assign that individual to one of, up here, 2 ancestors or one of 5 ancestors. And when we do that, you have your southern Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt murrayi that cluster with the other subspecies or that share an ancestor with the other subspecies, whereas the northern populations don't and have their own separate ancestral population. And if you tell the model, hey, do this and tell me that if there are 5 ancestral populations, they break out pretty consistently into, that's 4. How many? Hold on, count 1, 2, 3, 4. They break out into 5 different ancestors, with the southern murrayi having their own ancestor, the 2 other subspecies, and the northern ones having 2 separate ancestors. So really what this data is telling us is that the northern population of murrayi is quite different from the population that's down by Mexico City. And yet they're still the same subspecies at the moment. That's how they're designated. So we were then take a look at, like, where should these murrayi species individuals be? So in black here, you plotted suitable habitat for these turtles based on things like rainfall, temperature, that kind of thing, are all the kind of like black shading. And then he took data that's largely publicly available from historic accounts, iNaturalist reports, public data sets, where hirtipes murrayi have been identified, and can build a distribution model. Where do we think that these individuals are? And you'll notice that the suitable habitat and where we think these turtles are, which are these little pink dots here, don't fully overlap, which is just an interesting observation that we will get back to later. But so some of the take-homes from this study that was published in 2022 is this highlighting that the northern population of murrayi is quite different genetically from the southern Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt population of murrayi. In order to really get a sense of how different they are, and if they are, for example, 2 different subspecies, they recommended more sampling of the northern population. They also identified that, these northern turtles live in regions that are pretty high risk for climate-related habitat loss. So they mapped out projected habitat health, I suppose, over the next 40 years or so, and found that there are pretty good, that many scenarios would be quite poor outcomes for these turtles in northern Mexico here and southern Texas. And so at the time of publication, the conservation status was considered insecure for these turtles, and in Texas, critically imperiled. So then comes us. Well, us again. We sought out to extend that work quite a bit. To do so, we asked like 2 questions-ish. Is Kinosternon hirtipes murrayi one subspecies or more than one? And just like, how are they doing? So we started by, these are the kind of locations that were sampled in the Weaver study. And so we started by expanding those and adding locations, mostly in Durango and Chihuahua in Mexico, to really bridge that gap between the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt murrayi species and the ones sampled up in Texas. And so we looked for the distribution of these turtles, kind of just a sense of their habitat and how it's doing, and gathered genetic data so that we could look at genetic diversity. This was funded by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Not the license plate fund this time, but I would still get one of those plates if I could. So to expand on that data set, we sampled more than 40 locations across Texas and Mexico. In addition, probably so many more sites did we take water samples for eDNA. So in locations where we don't find turtles, we can still look for residual DNA that belongs to the turtles in water sources and say, hey, even if we didn't catch turtles here, they might still live here. And that's good to know to understand their distribution. We either trapped or hand caught turtles, for example, with a little net like this, or with your fingies. And then from the turtles, we either gathered what toe webbing tissue, like here, just a little snip, or blood samples for DNA, and then collected physical measurements like length, weight, sex, that kind of thing. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about just what we saw based on these habitats. Based on the species distribution modeling and iNaturalist data, we had a pretty good sense of where we would find turtles. And there were a lot of times that we were not successful. So for example, here's a lake in Chihuahua with evidence of, there's a dam that's been built across the lake. And as a result, a lake that would usually be, all the way up to here is quite small. So these kind of water disruptions can have a really big impact on our turtles. And therefore there's a lot of times we don't find turtles when we would expect to or have previously. I want to walk you through an example of a location that likely previously supported a population of turtles, but no longer does, because it's a great example of all the different ways that water can be disrupted and result in us not finding turtles, So, for example, here's a river. It's nice and winding. It's somewhat close to a population center. It looks like, just from the aerial footage, this is from 2025, a dam has been built. There's gravel, like a riverbed gravel, just past the dam, and then there are pecan farms right next to it. I lived in El Paso for a little bit, and we would go to the pecan farms in New Mexico quite a lot. And I didn't realize that they are such a bad idea in the desert. Most pecan farms do flood irrigation, which takes quite a bit of water from a pretty small water table. So let me just walk you through what this river looks like now. So south of this road here, we have what looks to be a suitable habitat for turtles. Nice murky water, lots of trees. If I was a turtle, I would consider living here. If you could travel down the river a bit, the water peters out, and you see the bottom of the river getting pretty dry. Now, if you're a turtle and you live in this suitable habitat and you need to travel down, you need to migrate for better habitat, you can still cross this gravel bed and probably get there. But you can this year. That doesn't mean you'd be able to next year, when potentially the water is even less. And if you're a turtle, you really don't want to go up north to this gravel mining location. There's little to no water, and it's a construction site, which is I don't think that's on the list of turtle preferences. And then if you go just downstream of this gravel site, you get an area that's just luminescent green, likely due to fertilizer runoff from the pecan farms. So you can imagine why this river no longer supports a turtle population, if it ever had one, and why turtles that might be present in this suitable habitat really would struggle to find new, better habitat. You're just a little wee turtle trying to get to a better place, you know? And even this level of river disruption is fairly recent. So this is aerial footage from 2003, where you can see we have a continuous river. There are trees along each side. There's no dam. There's no gravel mining. There are pecan farms. There also just looks like there's generally more water all around compared to more current day things. So this is the kind of very rapid ecological changes that our turtles are facing. And that's hard when you're in the desert and you have pretty limited habitat in the first place. But we did still find turtles. So, you know, no, not all hope is lost. This was a cool little spot where, you know, we found a handful of turtles, including an adolescent and 2 adults. And I just I wanted y'all to see what you do to weigh a baby turtle. It's basically how you weigh luggage at the airport. So, but in tiny turtle form. So over about 2 years, we managed to catch 107 turtles at 27 sites, largely in Chihuahua and Durango. We took the genetic data from these 107 turtles and combined it with our previous study published in 2022, and now have the genetic data for 262 turtles across 37 localities. This includes both Kinosternon, hirtipes, murrayi populations, Texas, Chihuahua, Durango, and down in the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt in Michoacan, as well as the other subspecies, excluding, of course, megacephalum, which is now extinct, and a handful of other Kinosternon species for good comparisons. So we took our genetic data, our massive data set, and started with just a phylogeny. How are these turtles historically related to each other? So down here you have your Kinosternon species in general, the other ones. You have your murrayi that live near Mexico City. You have other Kinosternon subspecies. That's your please don't make me say the names again. But like your terrescent, your other subspecies. And then fairly diverged, you have the Durango population, Chihuahua population, Texas, and then sometimes some Chihuahua individuals share some ancestry with Texas. So that's pretty cool. But we've expanding our collection data has definitely shown us that there is a fairly deep divergence between other Kinosternon species and hirtipes murrayi that live north of the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt. So when we look at just our murrayi populations, we narrowed our data set down to areas where we had a lot of individuals and could get a really good sense of their population structure. A couple of sites in Chihuahua, a couple sites in Texas, Durango, and then our TMVB population. And when we plot them how we did previously, where you can, show how genetically similar individuals are to each other, we get a cluster of the southern population, fairly distinct from all of the northern populations. And each of those northern populations are distinct from each other. Now, this southern population is pulling a lot of weight on this plot. So, for example, one thing we can do is remove the southern population and look at how do just these northern ones relate to each other? How similar are they? How different are they? And we get pretty distinct clusters of Durango, Chihuahua, and Texas plus a Chihuahua, which is pretty cool. And I have thoughts about this, so I will tell you them in a second. And we can also go back and look at ancestry, like an attempt to assign ancestry to each of these individuals. So each bar here, as a reminder, is an individual, and our model is attempting to assign them to an ancestral population. When we do this, we get Durango individuals. All are assigned to a single ancestor, which I've denoted with a little Durango turtle up here. Our Chihuahua turtles are all largely assigned to their own ancestor. And then there's one little bonus one who gets assigned to a Texas ancestor, whereas all the Texas ones share an ancestral Texas population. And importantly, all the southern Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt ones share their own ancestral population. So this is suggesting that each of these populations have pretty distinct ancestors. And I have a theory for why. And it starts with migration and divergence. So say you are a handful of turtles, or many, many turtles, that live in these mountains of the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt. And there's a couple different subspecies of you. And one of them, your Kinosternon hirtipes murrayi, that lives in Michoacan, decides to set out up the river into Durango. And you populate that area. And then further down the line, you end up in Chihuahua and populate that area. And eventually you end up in southern Texas and populate that area with a subset of murrayi turtles that are technically the same subspecies as where you originated from, but are now quite diverged. And this pattern of migration, as we've seen in our distribution in the field, would also explain why we see turtles that kind of go up into Chihuahua here and over into Texas, but not in Coahuila, where you would expect to see, based on habitat, turtles. And my theory on this is that in Chihuahua, these turtles actually traveled probably up the Rio Conchos into the Rio Grande and then got into Texas that way. So it's just a reminder that in the desert, all water is essential and connected. And that's how you get turtles in Texas when they came from Mexico City, you know? Cool. So I want to talk a little bit about the conservation status of these rough-footed mud turtles. So based on the kind of habitats they inhabit and some of the genetic data that I didn't really go into, the Texan, Chihuahuan, and Durango populations, those northern populations of Kinosternon hirtipes murrayi, do appear to be at risk in a rapidly changing climate, particularly as a result of water management practices. And the difficulty of these turtles trying to adapt to this changing world is that they are aquatic, and so they rely on water in order to be able to migrate to better locations or survive long enough to adapt. And so kind of some of the results of the study that it is probably time for us to start a discussion about, are these northern murrayi populations a different subspecies from the southern Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt ones? How will that change our threat designations for conservation? It's time to kind of ask those questions together. And then there's also opportunities where we could use captive breeding programs, or even try to introduce turtles into these identified, suitable habitats in Coahuila in order to give them a better fighting chance in an uncertain climate future. So those are questions that we are all asking, and I hope other people are asking too. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty into these little turtles. They're very cute. One of my just like general calls to action, and this is something that I say especially for folks living in southern states, is like one thing you can really do to help is advocate for the Rio Grande and for water practices, because what happens up here in Colorado substantially can change how our turtles survive down here on the Rio Conchos. And this is actually probably a better image of how turtles came from like way down here up into Chihuahua and then up into Texas. So show the turtles some love and advocate for the Rio Grande. Okay, future directions. The study is not quite done. One of the cool things that came out of this, kind of adjacent to our work, is collection of all that eDNA data. Where every time we visited a watershed, whether there were turtles there or not, we collected environmental DNA to see if there are turtles there, even if we don't find them. And one of our collaborators, Richard Klein, their lab is working on this to get a really good understanding of the distribution of these northern Kinosternon species. Then we personally added 107 individuals, and in the time since Weaver was published in 2022, we've got more than 100 approximately iNaturalist observations of Kinosternon. And we can add these to our species distribution model to get a really even better sense of where these turtles should be, so that we can always go and check on them, and see how their habitat is doing. So huge shout out to folks that use iNaturalist to document your observations. That data does get used and it is very helpful. How else am I going to find turtles in the middle of the desert? Okay. I think I went a little too fast, but that's okay. That's why there's time for questions. In the meantime, though, I'm just going to thank, obviously, the Texas Parks and Wildlife for funding this project and being very supportive of our turtle work. The San Antonio Zoo, which was essential for administering this grant. The University of Minnesota and my advisor, Suzanne, of course, for support. Big shout out to Andy for just being like a total turtle genius, as far as I can tell. Rodrigo at UNAM for excellent turtle work. Becky for just like putting up with the administrative part, because grants are hard. Thank you, Becky. Richard Klein, and then a big shout out to both our Texan and Mexican private landowners for letting us come on your property and search for turtles. It's a huge help. And again, citizen scientists everywhere, keep putting stuff in iNaturalist. So, because it really does help. Okay. Now I need to catch my breath. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you, Riley. That's a lot of really great information there. We'll let everybody ruminate for a second, and please remember to put your questions for Riley in the chat, please, and I will read them out. Hey, I had a question based on your proposed hypothesis for the sort of pattern of genetic diversity. Do you have any estimates on sort of when all that may have taken place?
This kind of like migration scheme. I don't have a great sense of when yet. I have some calculations running that might help me figure that out. But I'm not 100% sure. I wouldn't. It's a good question, and it's one I definitely have, especially because, a big thing that it takes into account is when was water available in these regions for the turtles to migrate? How long ago was that, and how long have they been, adapting to this local environment as opposed to, down by Mexico City? It's a great question, and it's on my list of future directions.
Awesome, thanks. And then this is kind of cheating because I know, a little bit more about some parts of the project than you presented here today. But what about differences in genetic diversity between the populations that you've identified here?
That's a great question. So part of the one of the things that makes us so concerned for these northern populations, and mostly I didn't go into this because it's hard to visually present, but each of these northern populations have fairly low genetic diversity compared to these southern populations. And there's, historically the sense that we have of how much does genetic diversity contribute to like population health is the idea is that the more genetically diverse your population is, the more opportunity you have to be able to adapt to changing environments. That's kind of been the longstanding understanding of genetic diversity. I don't know. I think there was recently a paper came out that was like, actually, that's not very true. So it's kind of
Hmm.
hard to make that one-to-one argument of like how diverse they are to how healthy the population is. But each of these, for as widespread as they are, have pretty low diversity, um, which could indicate, just the fact that they're so isolated, that there's a lot more inbreeding because, you're trapped in the same pond as most of your ancestors have been, and it's hard to migrate when you're in the desert. I don't want to walk across the desert, but I'm also not a turtle, so
Okay, we did. Somebody's posted a question. How easy was it to travel around Mexico? Did you get to do any field work in Mexico?
I did do some field work with Mexico, and I had a really easy time. Um, we had a pretty easy time traveling in Mexico. I think the last time I was in the field for this project was November 2024. Um, and it's a pain to get across the border or to get back in, but generally we had a very easy time. People were incredibly accommodating. At the lake that I showed with the dam, we rolled up on just like um, some fishermen at night, and they handed us just whole fish to eat. It was awesome. So easy time traveling in Mexico, less easy time finding turtles. That one's harder.
A couple of other questions coming in now. Do you suspect their distribution might be wider in Texas if more sites could be studied?
I think so. I believe Texas actually has a pretty healthy population of them. Um, and actually, if we could get a good sense of how widely distributed they are across Texas, that might point us pretty well into, or point us to a better understanding of like, for example, if they did, you know, migrate up the Rio Conchos into Texas, how long ago was that? We might be able to map that based on how far into Texas we can find them, depending on habitat availability. Um, I would imagine that they enjoy Texas. I mean, I enjoy Texas, so I don't see why the turtles wouldn't.
Very good. Why are they called rough-footed?
That's a great question. That I don't. Here, let's go back to a picture of a little foot and see if we can figure it out together. I don't know. Suzanne, do you know? She's got a good idea
That
of.
is an that is an excellent question, and I don't know. So
I can
yeah,
jump in. They do have a lot of it's like a just rough skin on the. I'm trying to think what part of the foot it would be. Kind of on the inside, you know,
Mm,
just adjacent to um, like the where the heel would be, on the inside there. I'm not sure what the function of it is.
oh, like down here.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's very, and on the inside of the thigh as well. It's just a really sort of rough patches of skin.
Hmm. I like that.
Well, the questions are coming in fast now. Okay. Have you considered using CRISPR to introduce more genetic diversity into the turtles or any species? Is there enough known about their genomes to do this? Wow. So we're talking about kind of creating additional genetic diversity in the lab here.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. I will say we do not genetically have a good enough honestly, we don't have a good enough genome for these turtles to be able to do that. We don't have a reference genome, for one. And for two, I don't think that we're at the point in our understanding of CRISPR yet, especially in wild animals, to get a good sense of what genes would be helpful to create diversity in. Honestly, my first target would probably be immune function genes. I don't think we're quite there, but I like where your head's going.
You need Colossus to figure that out, right? Okay, another question. Did you find different age classes where you were surveying, or were they all adults? You mentioned that one site you found a subadult.
We found a good number of juveniles and subadults, as well as adults. So yeah, there are little ones out there. You know, someone's making turtles.
Excellent. Is it known how far individuals disperse? Does that differ between populations?
Do we know how much they migrate, or like how much they travel? I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if maybe you do or Suzanne does.
I don't
I'm sure
know.
I'm sure it's changed as the, I mean, we were just talking about yesterday how some of the sites I visited 20 years ago are dry now, and I'm sure how much they're able to travel is dependent on how connected the water is. And so whatever you're going to get from the genetic data about dispersal is going to be historical over the last several thousand years, right? And not be able to tell us much about like the last 20 years.
Yeah, yeah,
And I don't think anybody's done telemetry on these guys at all or anything like that.
yeah. No, it's a really good point that um, migration is slow, especially when you're, you know, a 6-inch long turtle. And so when we talk about migration and um, finding new, better environments, it takes a very long time for a turtle to get from, many, many generations for a turtle to get from Mexico City up to Presidio County. And when your water pathways are rapidly shrinking within a year or 20 years or whatever, that really limits your ability to travel. It's a good point to
Yeah,
remind folks of.
I'm aware of sort of anecdotal observations of turtles moving between ponds at a short distance, kind of a mile or so from one
Yeah.
site to another through, what is relatively inhospitable uplands. But,
Sure.
they could probably make that move on a wet day.
Mhm. Or, I mean, you see turtle. I mean, we up here we see a ton of painted box turtles crossing the road. I think that level of
Oh.
migration makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But trying to cross, from even Presidio over to Dallas or something could take generations and generations.
So I think if you some of like an analogous kind of system to kind of like a tiny little snapshot is when Quattro Ciénegas, whenever we were working there, and um, there's this Howarth 2008 paper that we put out where we actually like went back every month and recaptured the aquatic box turtle, and it's very similar to the system except for it's just on a smaller scale where you have these turtles that have to cross desert matrix using water connections, and we found yearly migrations between different ephemeral ponds, which is kind of amazing, and it was several miles at a time they could do this across the year. And so I think, they can cruise if they have the water connections, but that's their mechanism, like that is gone now for so many of these
Mhm.
populations.
And so you get stuck in the same rivers or ponds and have no choice but inbreeding, and you get low diversity, and it all kind of and more divergence, and it all kind of goes from there.
Well, excellent. Well, good question. Have you considered historical water table data and rain estimations over the years in order to try to determine when the turtles would have migrated and potentially predict further migrations?
It's a good question. I don't have a good sense of how far back the historic water records go. I know some of them, there are water record like rainfall records going out to like the 1800s and stuff. Um, in terms of these turtles, for example, the migration from Mexico City-ish to Presidio County probably happened tens of thousands of years ago, if not longer. But I do think that there are ways to kind of estimate large scale water changes in that time period. And I think it's a great idea that I wish I was a hydrogeologist to do, Um, in terms
I
of
think when you're
predicting, hmm,
I was going to say, I think when you're thinking about writing this paper up, there's probably some paleoclimate data for at least part of this, either taken from like pollen cores or something like that. And uh, for the areas where they're living now, at least going
mhm,
back probably Holocene type. And so
that's so cool.
time scale. So I think that like you could get some estimates of that. And it's like the environment that you showed, that it's like the paradise to wasteland, that I think that's what you're gonna see if you had some paleoclimate. And it's pretty sparse, but I think you could probably find a few studies across the current range.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I just need to brush up on my geology. I think I
There's
can
some
do that.
interesting sources too in Presidio County about historical mining activities and stuff, and some of the deforestation
Oh,
that has completely altered a lot of the water out there as well. Though they could have had easier connections out in there. If you read the history of Shafter, it's pretty interesting and could contribute to that.
honestly, I'd love to do a deep dive into a couple of these like stories based around water. Like yeah, like vignettes about water in this area and the changes that have happened due to that. I think that would be really fascinating. And
Well,
I just
happy to
need,
host you down here again, and we can make another road trip out to Presidio and hang out and stuff.
oh, yeah, let's do it. I'm
Do some
ready.
history scrounging for writing this
Oh,
paper.
that'd be so cool.
Any time spent in West Texas is good time.
I agree. I would agree with that.
All right, moving on to the next question here. Do the turtles prefer streams and rivers or lakes, ponds, and reservoirs?
I don't know that they have a preference. I know that they like pretty like gross areas, you know? They're turtles, they're smelly. But I don't know if they would like rivers or streams or ponds better. Maybe based on how much oxygen is available, but they're not fish, right? So they don't need to be dependent on like the oxygenation of the water. Um, it's a good question. We found them largely in rivers, but it's a little bit, to me, it's just easier to trap rivers because you can access the shoreline. So I don't know if there's a smaller like area for them to be in, so it's easier to catch them. But I don't know if they would prefer one over the other. Obviously, some of the species down by Mexico City are like stuck in ponds and river and lakes. So I don't know. They seem to do okay either way.
Okay, another question. I didn't hear what you said about the protected status. Are these turtles listed as endangered?
Currently, no. I think there's a couple of levels of conservation status. So globally, because they are one species, just Kinosternon hirtipes, they're listed as like fine. Um, some of the specific subspecies are listed as uh, threatened or hold on, what was the exact terms used? Insecure or critically imperiled or threatened. That's kind of where it gets messy with all these subspecies. Like, um, if you have 6 subspecies, do you treat them all separately with their own conservation status? I would argue yes, because, for example, we lost one recently. But when it comes to like listings and also laws, I think it gets complicated. And I'm not sure what my recommendation would be for the listing now. I think we got to talk it out. Huh, Paul?
In Texas, the state lists them as threatened, which means
Okay.
they are protected from.
I think maybe
can't
this.
collect.
Yeah, I think this changed from between 2022 to recently for Texas.
Yeah, I think critically imperiled is probably nature serve terminology for the sort of formal status of the population, whereas like the regulatory situation in Texas is that things are either endangered or threatened, and we listed as threatened.
Perfect.
There's a comment here. It says about the dispersal thing. It said it would be interesting to know typical distances that they're currently dispersing, and if that's increasing because of the fragmentation of the habitat, presumably, and if they're doing it in search of breeding or some signal they're receiving that their water was drying or something entirely different. I think it would be cool to know more about their movement ecology.
Yeah, and actually, I think that would be an interesting project, maybe with some of the Texas landowners out there who have turtles on their land, and see if we could do a study similar to what Suzanne was talking about with the box turtles, where you tag them and then kind of go back yearly to see are they moving around or are they not. And I think that'd be a pretty cool study. So highly agree, commenter.
And then the last question is, could you swap a few Durango turtles and Chihuahua turtles to increase diversity? Or would that be a bad idea?
What do you think? I think you could. I mean, nothing could stop you from doing that. I don't know enough about the actual genes that are different between the two of them, or like the physiology that's different between the two populations, to get a sense of that, if that would be a like harmful thing to do. So for example, if the Durango populations are particularly well adapted to, I don't know, higher salt content in the water that the Chihuahua ones aren't, that could be a difficult transition for two turtles to make. But I mean, as a way to increase diversity, actually, that's probably something that we could model and figure out. Hey, if we like artificially bred these two populations, what kind of genetic diversity do we get out? I think that'd be an interesting question. So I'm not taking it off the table, is what I'm saying.
Very good. Well, that was the last of the questions.